In the heart of the village of Umuchi, surrounded by tall trees and the flowing waters of the great river, there lived a mighty warrior named Ikena. He was admired by everyone for his unmatched strength and bravery in battle. Whenever enemies threatened the land, it was Ikena who led the warriors to victory, returning home with tales of triumph and spoils from his conquests. Ikena was not just a force on the battlefield. He was also known for his striking appearance. Tall and well-built, with broad shoulders and a chiseled jawline, he was the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. His deep voice carried authority, and his eyes held a spark of confidence that made him even more captivating. Many women in the village admired him, but it was his wives who knew the depths of his charm and strength. His home, a large compound on the edge of the village, was a place of comfort and wealth. But inside those walls, not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Ikena had 3 wives. His first wife, Amaka, was the embodiment of wisdom and care. She had been with Ikena for many years, long before he became the revered warrior he was now. Amaka had given him children and had managed the home with grace and skill. She was known in the village as a strong and respectable woman. But as time passed, Ikena's attention slowly drifted from her. Then came Kemi, the second wife. Kemi was beautiful, with long flowing hair and a charm that captured the hearts of many. She was admired for her social skills, often the center of attention at village gatherings. Ikena had fallen for her beauty and poise, and soon she too became one of his wives. But with Kemi's arrival, the delicate balance within the household shifted. Finally, there was Tari, the youngest and most recent wife. Tari was different from the others, soft-spoken with a quiet grace that seemed to enchant Ikena from the moment he laid eyes on her. Her presence brought a new kind of warmth to the household, but it also stirred emotions that had been buried deep within Amaka and Kemi. Although Ikena tried to treat all his wives equally, it was clear to anyone who watched that Tari had become his favorite. He brought her gifts from his journeys, spent long evenings with her, and sought her company more than that of the others. To Amaka, who had once been the center of his world, this was a painful shift. Kemi too noticed the change and felt a sting of jealousy each time Ikena favored Tari over her. As Ikena returned from his latest victorious battle, the village held a great celebration. Drums echoed through the air, and people danced in the moonlight, welcoming their hero home. Ikena, proud and honored, received gifts and praise from the elders and the villagers alike. But his attention soon turned to his household. He had brought treasures from his journey: fine beads, colorful fabrics, and precious stones. Each wife received something, but it was Tari who received the finest of them all. She smiled shyly as Ikena presented her with a necklace of the purest gold, its pendant sparkling under the flickering light of the torches. Amaka and Kemi watched in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of growing resentment. Tari's eyes glistened with happiness as she accepted the gift, but behind her, the storm of jealousy was slowly gathering. Amaka and Kemi exchanged glances, an unspoken understanding passed between them. While they had been rivals for Ikena's affection before, they now found themselves on the same side, united by the bitterness growing in their hearts toward the youngest wife. The days following Ikena's return from battle were filled with mixed emotions in his household. Tari basked in the attention of her husband, her soft laughter echoing through the compound as Ikena spent his evenings by her side. She wore the golden necklace proudly, and every time the sunlight caught it, it seemed to remind Amaka and Kemi of their fading influence over the man they had once called their own. Ikena, unaware of the growing tension, continued to lavish Tari with gifts and attention. He spoke often of how her gentle nature soothed his spirit after the chaos of war. "Tari has a way of calming me," he would say, not realizing that each word was like a knife to the hearts of his other wives. Amaka, the first wife, was deeply affected. She had been there since the beginning, when Ikena was just starting his journey as a warrior. She had borne him children, managed his household, and stood by him in times of hardship. But now, it seemed all of her loyalty and effort were being overshadowed by the charm of a much younger wife. One evening, as Ikena sat with Tari under the shade of a large tree, Amaka watched from a distance. Her heart felt heavy with a mix of sadness and anger. How could the man she had stood by for so long forget her so easily? It wasn't just the gifts or the time he spent with Tari. It was the affection, the warmth in his eyes that used to be hers. Kemi, too, felt the sting of being pushed aside. Although she had never expected to be the favorite, Kemi had always been used to admiration, whether from Ikenna or the villagers who often commented on her beauty. But now, even that seemed to fade in comparison to Tari's quiet allure. Every time she saw Ikenna and Tari together, her frustration grew. The once harmonious household was now brimming with unspoken jealousy. One night, as the air in the village was still and the moon shone brightly in the sky, Kemi decided to approach Amaka. She found her sitting by the fire, her face deep in thought. "Sister," Kemi began, her voice low and cautious. "We need to talk." Amaka looked up, surprised. The two women had never been particularly close. Each occupied their own space in Ikenna's life. But now, Kemi's words carried a sense of urgency that Amaka couldn't ignore. "What is it?" she asked, her voice wary. Kemi sat down beside her and glanced toward the hut, where Tari and Ikenna were laughing softly. "You see what is happening?" Kemi said, her tone sharpening. "He hardly looks at us anymore. Everything is about Tari now. If we don't do something, we will be forgotten." Amaka was silent for a moment, considering Kemi's words. She knew they were true. For weeks she had watched Ikenna's affection for Tari grow, and it seemed that no matter what she or Kemi did, they couldn't reclaim his attention. But the idea of taking action, of doing something to change the situation, felt foreign to her. She had always been the dutiful wife, never questioning her husband's choices. "What can we do?" Amaka finally asked, her voice tinged with resignation. Kemi's eyes gleamed with determination. "We need to remind him of who we are," she said firmly. "We need to make sure he sees that we are still here, that we are just as important." Amaka looked at Kemi, the younger woman's resolve catching her off guard. She had never seen Kemi like this before, so focused, so sure of herself. For the first time, Amaka felt a flicker of something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. Maybe they didn't have to stand idly by while Tari claimed more and more of Ikenna's heart. Maybe they could do something to turn things around. And so an unlikely alliance was formed. Amaka and Kemi, once content to live in their separate roles as Ikenna's wives, now found themselves united by a common goal. Together, they would figure out a way to shift the balance of power back in their favor. But as they sat by the fire that night, plotting in hushed voices, neither of them knew just how far this alliance would take them, or the consequences that would follow. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Ikenna's household only grew. Tari remained the center of his world, and no matter how hard Amaka and Kemi tried to reclaim his attention, nothing seemed to work. Ikenna was captivated by Tari's quiet grace and the peace she brought him. The once lively home now felt like a battlefield of silent rivalries and hidden bitterness. Frustrated by their lack of progress, Kemi urged Amaka to take more drastic measures. "We can't just sit here and watch her take everything," Kemi said one evening, her voice edged with desperation. "If we don't act soon, we'll be nothing more than shadows in this household." Amaka, usually the calmer of the two, found herself agreeing. The pain of being overlooked had grown too strong. She knew something had to change, but she wasn't sure how. That was when Kemi mentioned the old woman who lived at the edge of the village, a healer known for her mysterious powers. "They say she can help with matters of the heart," Kemi whispered. "I've heard of women who went to her, desperate to win their husbands back. She gave them something that made their husbands fall in love with them all over again." Amaka was skeptical. She had heard the rumors about the healer too, but she had never believed in such things. Still, she was desperate. If there was even a small chance that this woman could help them, it was worth considering. "Do you really think she can help us?" Amaka asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Kemi nodded. "We have nothing to lose." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Amaka and Kemi set out to find the healer. The path to the edge of the village was long and winding, taking them through dense trees and past a stream that glittered under the early morning light. The healer's hut was small and secluded, hidden from view by thick vines and towering trees. As they approached, a sense of unease settled over them. The air felt heavy, and the silence was almost deafening. Kemi hesitated for a moment, but Amaka, her resolve strengthened by the weight of her suffering, stepped forward and knocked on the door. The door creaked open, revealing a frail old woman with eyes that seemed to pierce through their souls. She wore a tattered shawl, and her hands were worn from years of work. But there was something powerful about her presence. Something that made Amaka and Kemi feel both fearful and hopeful. "I know why you've come," the healer said in a voice as rough as the bark of the trees around them. "You seek to reclaim what has been taken from you." Amaka and Kemi exchanged glances, surprised by the woman's directness. "We need your help," Amaka said cautiously. "Our husband, he no longer looks at us the way he used to. There is another, and she has taken his heart." The healer smiled, a slow and unsettling smile that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. "Men are easily swayed by beauty and charm," she said. "But there are ways to remind them of where their true loyalty lies." She turned and disappeared into the shadows of her hut, leaving Amaka and Kemi standing in silence. Moments later, she returned, holding a small clay jar filled with a thick, dark liquid. "This," she said, holding the jar out to them, "will make your husband remember you. It will stir his desires and bind his heart to yours once more. But be warned, its effects are powerful. Once given, there is no turning back." Amaka reached out to take the jar, her hands trembling slightly. "How do we use it?" she asked. "Add just a few drops to his food or drink," the healer instructed. "He will not notice the taste, but the effects will take hold soon after. Be careful not to use too much, for desire can be a dangerous thing when it is not controlled." Kemi's eyes gleamed with excitement, but Amaka felt a knot of unease in her stomach. This was not the kind of path she had ever imagined taking, but the pain of being ignored was too strong, and the thought of watching Tari continue to steal Ikena's heart was unbearable. As they left the healer's hut and made their way back to the village, the jar felt heavy in Amaka's hands. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. That night, Amaka and Kemi stood in the kitchen, the jar between them. The plan was simple. They would add a few drops of the potion to Ikena's evening meal and wait for the magic to take effect. But as the liquid swirled in the jar, dark and mysterious, Amaka couldn't help but wonder if they were making a terrible mistake. And as they prepared Ikena's food, neither of them could foresee the chain of events that this single act would set in motion. That night, the compound was unusually quiet. The only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Amaka and Kemi had prepared Ikena's favorite meal and carefully added a few drops of the healer's potion into his food, just as instructed. With their hearts pounding in their chests, they watched as Ikena took the first bite. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Ikena ate his meal in silence, occasionally glancing over at Tari, who sat quietly by his side. Amaka and Kemi exchanged nervous glances, wondering if the potion had worked. But as the evening wore on, something began to change. Ikena's eyes darkened with a new intensity. He looked at each of his wives differently, but instead of showering Amaka and Kemi with the attention they had hoped for, his gaze seemed to drift elsewhere. His desires were stirred just as the healer had promised, but they didn't take the course Amaka and Kemi had expected. Days later, Ikena returned from a battle in the neighboring village, and with him came a new bride, Simi. Simi was younger than any of the other wives, with skin as smooth as polished stone and a smile that could make anyone stop in their tracks. She had long, flowing hair that cascaded down her back like a river, and her eyes sparkled with mischief. The arrival of Simi threw the household into turmoil. Tari, who had once been Ikena's favorite, was now forgotten, just as Amaka and Kemi had been before her. But this time it wasn't Tari who was receiving the warrior's affection. Simi quickly became the center of Ikena's world, and the other wives could do nothing but watch as their husband lavished her with gifts, attention, and love. Amaka and Kemi were horrified. The potion had worked, but not in the way they had intended. Instead of returning to them, Ikena's heart had shifted to someone new, someone who hadn't been part of their plan. They had inadvertently opened the door for another rival, one they could not control. Tari, who had once felt secure in Ikena's love, was now the one left behind. She too felt the sting of jealousy and rejection, her heart burning with the same bitterness that had once consumed Amaka and Kemi. But unlike the others, Tari remained quiet, her anger festering silently. Simi, unaware of the tension brewing around her, basked in Ikena's attention. She wore the finest clothes, ate the best food, and held her head high, oblivious to the growing storm around her. The other wives tried to hide their resentment, but their whispers grew louder with each passing day. "We must do something," Kemi said one evening, her voice shaking with frustration. "We cannot let this continue. First it was Tari, now it's Simi. If we don't act soon, we'll lose everything." Amaka nodded, her face grim. "We cannot allow her to take everything we've worked for." Tari, who had been listening quietly from the shadows, finally stepped forward. "I will help you," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know what it feels like to be cast aside. If we work together, we can remove Simi from this house." Amaka and Kemi looked at her in surprise. Tari had always been soft-spoken, never one to involve herself in schemes. But now they saw something different in her eyes, a determination that matched their own. At that moment, the three wives formed an alliance, united by their shared pain and jealousy. The plan was simple. They would drive Simi away, just as they had intended to do with Tari. But fate, as it often does, had something else in store for them. One evening, as the wives prepared dinner for the household, they decided to add something extra to Simi's meal, a small, harmless ingredient that would cause her discomfort, enough to make her leave. But what they didn't know was that the healer's potion still lingered in the kitchen, its effects not yet fully dissipated. By accident, a few drops of the potion found their way into Simi's food, turning what was meant to be a harmless prank into something far more dangerous. That night, after eating the tainted meal, Simi fell gravely ill. Her body writhed in pain, and within hours, she lay motionless on her bed, her once radiant skin pale and cold. The household was thrown into chaos as word of her sudden illness spread through the village. Despite the best efforts of the local healer, Simi did not recover. The very next day she passed away, leaving behind a household shrouded in grief and suspicion. Ikena, devastated by the loss of his new bride, was inconsolable. He mourned deeply, unaware of the role his other wives had played in the tragedy. As the village whispered of possible foul play, Amaka, Kemi, and Tari realized the gravity of what they had done. What had begun as a plan to drive away a rival had ended in death, and they knew that if the truth came to light, the consequences would be dire. Simi's sudden death sent shockwaves through the household. Whispers spread quickly through the village, with many suspecting foul play. Ikena, devastated by the loss, fell into a deep well of grief. His once proud and commanding presence began to fade. He became distant, no longer engaging with his wives or the village. His once sharp mind, known for strategy and wisdom, now seemed clouded with sorrow and confusion. Ikena spent hours sitting alone, staring into the distance as if searching for answers that never came. His mental state worsened with each passing day, and the warrior who once commanded the respect of all was now a shadow of himself. The village too noticed the change and whispered about his decline, with some suggesting that the spirits were punishing him for reasons unknown. Left to manage the household on their own, Amaka, Kemi, and Tari continued to live in silence, watching Ikena slip further away from them. His affection, once divided among them, had vanished entirely. They felt the loss deeply, but one wife's heart was more troubled than the others. Tari. Unlike Amaka and Kemi, who had accepted the shift in Ikena's love over time, Tari could not bear the idea of being forgotten. She had once been his favorite, the one who made him smile and brought him peace. But with Simi's death, even Tari's position in his heart seemed to vanish. Her desperation to regain Ikena's attention grew, and it was this desperation that led her to consider a dangerous path. one that she would walk alone. One evening, as the household lay quiet under the stars, Tari made her decision. She would visit the oracle. She was a powerful witch who could make anything possible, and getting a potion to stir Ikena's desires shouldn't be that hard. Tari's intentions were different. She no longer wanted to share Ikena's love with the others. She wanted him for herself. Before dawn the next morning, Tari slipped out of the compound and made her way to the edge of the village, where the oracle lived in a secluded hut. When she arrived, the healer was waiting. "Welcome, young one," the healer said, her voice as rough as the bark of the trees surrounding her hut. "What is it you seek?" Tari hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice low and determined. "I want Ikena to love me, and only me." The healer studied Tari for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to pierce through her thoughts. "Be careful what you ask for," she said quietly. "Magic that binds a man's heart is powerful, but it comes with a cost." "I don't care," Tari replied, her desperation clear. "I want him back. I want him to love me as he once did." The healer nodded slowly as if she had expected this. She disappeared into the shadows of her hut and returned moments later with a small jar filled with a dark, thick liquid. "There is a way," the healer said, holding the jar out to Tari. "But it is dangerous. If you want to bind Ikena's heart to yours forever, you must be willing to make a great sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" The healer's gaze darkened as she spoke. "His manhood." Tari froze, her breath catching in her throat. The words echoed in her mind, heavy and terrifying. She had expected something extreme, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The healer's expression remained unchanged. "I am always serious when it comes to magic this strong. If you want him to belong to you and you alone, this is the price you must pay. But know this, once the act is done, there is no going back. He will be yours, but he will be changed forever." Tari stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had already come so far, had already allowed jealousy and desperation to consume her heart. Could she really go through with this? Could she sacrifice Ikena's manhood in order to keep his affection for herself alone? Her mind raced, but in the end her desire to have Ikena's love all to herself outweighed the fear of what she was about to do. "I'll do it," Tari said finally, her voice steady. The healer handed her the jar. "Add this to his drink," she instructed. "It will make him weak, but you must act quickly. The rest, you already know what to do." Tari left the healer's hut with the jar in her hands and a storm in her heart. She knew the path she was about to take would change everything, but in her mind, there was no other option. Ikena would be hers, no matter the cost. Tari returned to the compound just before dawn. The jar clutched tightly in her hands. The air was cool, and a faint mist hung over the village. She moved quietly through the shadows, her heart racing with the weight of what she was about to do. The others were still asleep, unaware of the betrayal she was planning to carry out. For a moment, as she stood outside Ikena's sleeping quarters, doubt crept into her mind. The thought of harming him, of taking something so vital from the man she once loved purely, filled her with a sense of dread. But as quickly as the doubt appeared, it was washed away by the burning desire that had driven her here. She wanted him for herself, completely. And this was the only way. Tari slipped into the room where Ikena lay sleeping. His once powerful frame, now weakened by grief, was draped over the simple mat. His breathing was slow and steady, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Tari watched him for a moment, her heart tightening with a mixture of love and sorrow. This would be the last time she would see him as the man he had been. Taking a deep breath, Tari uncorked the jar and poured the dark liquid into a cup of water. She had already prepared his favorite herbal tea earlier, knowing he would drink it before the morning began. With trembling hands, she placed the cup beside his bed and waited. It wasn't long before Ikena stirred. He opened his eyes slowly, still half lost in the haze of sleep. When his gaze landed on the cup, he reached for it without thinking, as he had done so many mornings before. Tari watched silently as he lifted the cup to his lips and drank deeply, unaware of the poison he had just consumed. Within minutes, the effects began to take hold. Ikena's breathing grew heavier. His body slumped as the potion drained his strength. His eyes flickered open and closed, confusion clouding his mind. He tried to speak, but his words came out in slurred whispers. "Tari, what's happening?" Tari knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his chest. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice soothing despite the turmoil inside her. "Everything will be all right." Ikena's eyes closed again, his body growing limp under the weight of the potion. His breathing slowed, and soon he was completely unconscious. Tari stood, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment, the point of no return. She retrieved the knife she had hidden in her garments, its blade gleaming in the dim light of the room. She had never imagined she would find herself here, standing over the man she loved, preparing to take the most precious part of him. Her hands shook as she knelt beside Ikena's motionless body. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding louder than ever before. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stop, to abandon this twisted ritual and leave before it was too late. But she pushed those thoughts away, focusing only on the goal, binding Ikena's love to her forever. With one final steadying breath, Tari raised the knife. The act was quick, but brutal. Blood stained her hands, and her heart clenched as she severed the part of Ikena that made him whole. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of her shallow breathing. It was done. Tari stood, holding the severed piece of Ikena in her trembling hands. Her mind swirled with a mixture of triumph and horror. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? This was the price she had agreed to pay for Ikena's love. But now that the act was done, a deep sense of dread washed over her. She had crossed a line she could never return from. With the ritual halfway complete, Tari hurried to the kitchen, where she prepared the pepper soup. It was a dish Ikena had always loved, and tonight it would be more than just a meal. It would seal the bond between them forever. She added the meat to the boiling pot, stirring it with shaking hands as the rich aroma filled the room. As she waited for the potion to take full effect, Tari's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. She knew the consequences of her actions would be severe. What she had done could never be undone. But deep down, a part of her believed that this was the only way. Ikena would be bound to her, his love sealed by the dark magic of the healer. The night stretched on, and as Tari watched the pot simmer, the weight of her choices began to sink in. She had done the unthinkable, and now there was no turning back. The night passed slowly, and as dawn broke over the village, the weight of Tari's actions pressed down on her like never before. The air in the compound was thick with an eerie stillness, and every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. The soup was ready, but the real test was yet to come. When Ikena awoke, Tari sat by his side, her heart racing as she waited for him to stir. The morning sun crept through the small window. Her eyes flicked nervously to the door, half expecting someone to come in and discover what she had done. But for now, the compound remained silent. Finally, Ikena began to move. His eyelids fluttered and he groaned softly as he regained consciousness. Tari's heart leapt into her throat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would determine whether the ritual had worked. "Ikena," she whispered, leaning over him. "How do you feel?" Ikena opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused and filled with confusion. For a moment he didn't seem to recognize her. Then, slowly, his eyes cleared, and he stared at her in silence. Something was different. His once fierce and proud spirit seemed dulled, like a flame that had been snuffed out. Tari held her breath, waiting for him to speak, but when he did, his voice was weak, devoid of the strength and authority it once carried. "What happened?" Tari smiled, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "You were unwell, my love," she lied softly. "But I took care of you. You will be fine now." Ikena blinked slowly, his eyes still clouded with confusion. He shifted in his bed and then, suddenly, a flicker of pain crossed his face. His hand moved toward his lower body and Tari's heart stopped as she realized what was about to happen. Ikena's hand froze, his eyes widening in shock. He looked at her, a wild, panicked expression spreading across his face. What? What have you done? Tari's heart raced. She reached for his hand, trying to calm him, but he pulled away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He tried to sit up, but the weakness in his body prevented him from moving too quickly. "Ikena, please," Tari said, her voice trembling. "It was for us, for our love. You belong to me now, forever." But Ikena's eyes were filled with horror. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the woman he had once loved had transformed into something monstrous. You've taken everything from me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The realization of what she had done hit Tari like a crashing wave. She had bound him to her, yes, but in doing so, she had destroyed him. Ikena was no longer the strong, proud warrior who had led the village into battle. He was broken, both in body and in spirit. Suddenly, a noise from outside the room broke the tense silence. Voices, raised in alarm, drifted through the open window. Tari's heart leapt into her throat. The village. Word had spread quickly that something was wrong in Ikena's household. The villagers, already suspicious after Simi's sudden death, had been watching the compound closely. Now, with Ikena's strange behavior and absence from the public eye, their suspicions had grown into something far more dangerous. Tari hurried to the window and peered outside. A group of villagers had gathered at the entrance to the compound, murmuring amongst themselves, their faces filled with concern and anger. They knew something was wrong. Panic surged through Tari's veins. If they found out what she had done, she would be cast out, banished, or worse. The healer had warned her of the consequences, but she hadn't fully understood the weight of her actions until now. As the villagers began to approach the compound, Tari turned back to Ikena, who lay staring at the ceiling, lost in his own misery. Her heart ached for him, but it was too late to turn back now. She had made her choice, and now she would have to face the consequences. With trembling hands, Tari ran to the kitchen and quickly ladled out the pepper soup she had prepared the night before. The rich aroma filled the room as she carried the bowl to Ikena's bedside. "Here," she said, her voice shaking. "Eat this, my love. It will make you feel better," she said, handing him a bowl of hot pepper soup. But Ikena barely looked at her, his eyes distant and unfocused. He was no longer the man he had been. Just as the healer had said, he was bound to her, but at a terrible cost. Tari forced a smile, though inside she felt as though her world was crumbling around her. She had done this for love, for the hope of reclaiming what had been lost. But as she looked down at Ikena's lifeless eyes, she wondered if it had all been worth it. Outside, the villagers' voices grew louder. They were coming. The sun had barely risen when the crowd gathered outside the compound, their voices rising in concern and anger. Inside the house, Tari's heart raced as she glanced nervously between Ikena's weakened form on the bed and the door, where the voices of the villagers grew louder. Ikena was too weak to move, his body limp and his eyes barely focused, but Tari clung to one hope: the pepper soup. She had prepared it carefully, following the healer's instructions. The meat simmered in the rich broth, and the smell filled the room. It was supposed to make everything right again, to seal the bond between them, but time was running out. "Ikena, please," Tari whispered desperately, kneeling beside him. She lifted the bowl of pepper soup to his lips, her hands shaking. "You have to eat this. It will make you better. Everything will be all right." Ikena's head lolled to the side, his eyes glassy and filled with confusion. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He didn't have the strength to lift his hand, let alone eat. Tari's heart sank, but she couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything she had done. "Please, Ikena," she urged, her voice breaking. "Just drink a little. You'll see, you'll feel better. You'll be mine again." Tears filled her eyes as she spooned some of the soup to his lips. But Ikena turned his head away weakly, unable to even sip from the bowl. His once strong body had been reduced to this, all because of the dark magic she had invoked. Tari's chest tightened with panic. The voices outside grew louder, and then came the sound of heavy knocking on the door. The villagers had arrived, demanding answers. Tari's hands trembled as she set the bowl down beside the bed, her mind racing. She had to make them believe that everything was fine, that Ikenna would recover, but she could no longer ignore the truth. The knocking grew more insistent, and finally, with no other choice, Tari rose and opened the door. A group of villagers, led by one of the elders, stood at the entrance, their faces grim with suspicion. They pushed their way into the compound, their eyes sweeping over the scene. The broken warrior lying helpless on the bed, the bowl of untouched soup, the heavy atmosphere of secrecy. "What is happening here, Tari?" the elder demanded, his voice cold and accusing. "Where is Ikenna? Why is the great warrior lying in such a state?" Tari's throat tightened, her mind scrambling for an explanation. She glanced back at Ikenna, who was too weak to speak, too weak to defend himself. The villagers' eyes followed hers, and their expressions darkened. "Ikenna, he is unwell," Tari said, her voice trembling. "I've been taking care of him." One of the women in the crowd, a friend of Simi's, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "First Simi dies suddenly, and now Ikenna is like this. Something isn't right. What are you hiding, Tari?" The accusation hung in the air, and the other villagers murmured in agreement. Tari felt her world closing in around her. She had done all of this to bind Ikenna's love to her, but now it was unraveling in front of her. I didn't mean for this to happen," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I just wanted him to love me, like he used to." The elder's eyes narrowed and the crowd fell silent as he stepped closer to her. "What have you done, Tari?" Tari's hands shook, her knees weakening under the weight of her guilt. The truth was too heavy to carry any longer. She could no longer keep it hidden. "I went to the healer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wanted Ikenna's love, and she said she could help me, but I had to make a sacrifice. His manhood. I had no choice." A gasp of horror rippled through the crowd, and the elder's face darkened with shock and disgust. The villagers stared at her in disbelief, their eyes wide with revulsion. Magic, especially the kind that bound love, was forbidden in their village. What Tari had done was not only a betrayal of Ikenna, but of the entire village. "You sought dark magic," the elder said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You took your husband's manhood to control him?" Tari collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "I didn't want it to end like this. I thought it would make him love me again." The elder shook his head, his expression cold. "You have destroyed Ikenna, the pride of this village. You have betrayed us all." The crowd erupted in murmurs of anger and shock, and Tari felt the full weight of her actions crushing down on her. She had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her place in the village, and now there was nothing left but the consequences. The elder turned to the other village leaders, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. After a brief hushed conversation, the elder spoke again, his voice stern and final. "For your crimes, Tari, you will be banished from this village. You will leave at once, and you will never return. Your name will be forgotten, and you will live with the burden of your guilt for the rest of your days." Tari's heart shattered at the words. Banishment. To be cast out from the only home she had ever known, to wander the world alone marked by her betrayal. It was a fate worse than death. She had wanted Ikenna's love, but in the end, she had lost everything. With her head bowed and tears streaming down her face, Tari stood on trembling legs. The villagers turned their backs on her, their faces filled with disgust. The elder stepped aside, leaving the path clear for her to leave. As she walked out of the compound for the last time, Tari glanced back at Ikenna, hoping for some sign of forgiveness in his eyes. But he lay motionless, his face etched with pain and sorrow, too broken to offer her any solace. Tari turned and walked away, the sound of the villagers' murmurs fading behind her as she disappeared into the distance. She had made her choice, and now she would pay the price. The village was still reeling from the discovery of Tari's betrayal, but the truth had yet to fully unravel. As Tari disappeared into exile, whispers began to circulate about what had truly taken place in Ikenna's household. Though the villagers had seen Tari's desperate act, there were still questions left unanswered, questions about how things had escalated so far and why no one had stopped her. Suspicion turned toward Amaka and Kemi, Ikena's first and second wives. The villagers wondered how they could have stood by while their husband was destroyed, and soon enough, the truth began to surface. Some villagers recalled seeing the two wives grow distant, their once serene household slowly crumbling under jealousy and resentment. It wasn't long before rumors turned into revelations. Amaka and Kemi had played their parts in Ikena's downfall, and their act had led to Simi's untimely death. They had conspired against Tari, driven by jealousy when Ikena had favored her. They had sought to reclaim his love, but in doing so, they had sown the seeds of destruction. Though they had not wielded the knife, their actions had set the tragedy into motion, starting with Simi's death. The elders gathered once more, this time to decide the fate of the two remaining wives. Amaka and Kemi stood before the village, their heads bowed in shame as the accusations were laid bare. They had allowed their jealousy to fester, and in their desperation to control Ikena's love, they had unleashed forces beyond their control. The village elder, the same one who had sentenced Tari to exile, spoke again with the weight of the village's judgment in his voice. "You, Amaka, and you, Kemi, have betrayed your husband in your own way. Though it was Tari who committed the final act, your actions fed the flames of jealousy and set this tragedy in motion." Amaka's eyes filled with tears, while Kemi's face was pale with guilt. They had never intended for things to go this far. They had wanted Ikena's love, but they hadn't realized the consequences of their actions until it was too late. "You will not be banished like Tari," the elder continued. "Your punishment is different. You will stay by Ikena's side and care for him for the rest of your lives. You will watch him suffer and live with the knowledge that he is no longer the man he once was. You will feel the pain of having a husband without his manhood, a husband broken by your betrayal. This will be your burden." The village murmured in agreement, and Amaka and Kemi's hearts sank. They had hoped for forgiveness, but instead, they were sentenced to live in the very house they had conspired to tear apart. The knowledge that they had helped destroy the man they had once loved would haunt them every day, and there would be no escape from the pain. Far from the village, Tari wandered alone, carrying the weight of her guilt like a stone in her chest. The days were long, and the nights were filled with silence. She lived in seclusion, cut off from the world that had once been her home. No one came to see her, and no one called her name. She was forgotten, just as the elders had said. Yet, in her loneliness, Tari found herself reflecting on the choices she had made. Her desperate desire to control Ikena's love had driven her to dark places, and she had lost everything as a result. The love she had wanted so badly had turned into something twisted, and the price she had paid was too high. Over time, Tari began to understand the lesson she had been too blind to see before. Love cannot be forced, and jealousy only destroys what it seeks to possess. Her obsession with having Ikena all to herself had blinded her to the truth that love, when bound by greed and control, withers away. In her solitude, Tari found some measure of peace. She realized that her punishment was not just exile. It was the knowledge that her actions had broken the very thing she had tried to protect. She would live the rest of her life knowing that she had destroyed the man she loved, and that was a burden heavier than any sentence the village could have given her. Back in the village, the elders and healers did everything in their power to save Ikena's life. His body was frail, weakened by the loss of his manhood and the effects of the dark magic Tari had used. The villagers rallied around him, praying for his recovery, but it was clear that his life hung in the balance. Amaka and Kemi tended to him day and night, as the elder had decreed. They bathed him, fed him, and sat by his side, watching helplessly as the man they had once loved drifted in and out of consciousness. They could see the pain in his eyes, the pain of a warrior who had lost his strength, his pride, and his identity. Ikena's recovery was slow, and though his body began to heal, his spirit remained broken. He no longer spoke and no longer smiled. He also learned an important lesson, that perhaps seeking after so many women was not the answer because, in the end, it all started with him, his lust for beauty. As the years passed, the tale of Ikenna, Tari, Amaka, and Kemi became a lesson passed down through the village, a cautionary story about the dangers of jealousy, greed, and the desire to control love. The villagers remembered how a once great warrior had been brought low by the very people who claimed to love him. They remembered how jealousy had consumed the hearts of those who should have protected him, and how greed had led to the destruction of everything they held dear. But they also learned something more, something deeper. They learned that love, when built on trust and respect, flourishes. But when it is tainted by jealousy and the need for control, it crumbles. The villagers understood that true love could never be forced or manipulated. It could only grow when both hearts were free. And so the story of Ikenna and his wives was told for generations to come, a reminder of the fragility of love and the importance of kindness, trust, and humility. In the end, the story was not just about love lost. It was about the price of betrayal, the cost of jealousy, and the power of forgiveness that was never given.